page, our YouTube channel, and on our yiddishfest.org website. Shalom Aleichem. You probably know me by now. My name is Avi Hoffman, founder and CEO of the Yiddishkeit Initiative, Why I Love Jewish, and the inaugural international virtual Why I Love Yiddish Fest 2020. I am so excited that I'm sitting here live in the lobby of the Betsy Hotel, our festival sponsor, and we have just seen this magnificent documentary film about Chaim Plutzik, the American poet. And we have with us a very special guest who wrote the biographical and contextual information for Chaim Plutzik's Letter from a Young Poet. He was also the literary advisor for the film we just saw, which was by Oscar-nominated filmmaker Christine Choi. And I understand he is currently working on the Spanish translations of 32 Chaim Plutzik poems by 14 different translators, which will also include a foreword by President Obama's poet laureate, Richard Blanco. Welcome, Edward Moran.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for being here. We're very, very honored to have you and be part of the festival. So the first thing that occurs to me is Moran is probably not a Jewish name. So perhaps you could give us a little insight into how you discovered Chaim Plutzik. And you were telling me before we started that you have a fascination with the Yiddish language as well. So feel free to tell us a little bit about it.
All right. Well, I grew up in Pennsylvania in a small coal mining community. And I remembered as a child reading Leo Rosten's The Joys of Yiddish, which inspired me a great deal because I'm so interested in language. Even though we didn't speak Yiddish at home, I got interested in the film because over the years I became an editor and writer in New York, and I was the associate editor of the World Authors series by H.W. Wilson, which is biographical sketches of many different authors. So Christine Choi, the Oscar-winning filmmaker at NYU that I've known for years, one day came to me and said, "Who's Chaim Plutzik?" I said, well, he was a poet, and I knew a little bit about him, but not very much. And she said, well, let's do a film about him. They want us to do the University of Rochester, where he taught, put out a request for a proposal to do video archiving of Chaim Plutzik's poetry. So we decided to make a proposal to the family to do a documentary film about Chaim Plutzik. And they gave us their go-ahead, and we went and interviewed Stanley Kunitz, Grace Schulman, Donald Hall, Galway Connell, Hayden Carruth, many of the leading poets of the time, including especially Stanley Kunitz. We did his last interview at the age of 99. You saw him in the film. And Grace, of course, was the head of the Poetry Center at the YMHA in New York. So we've had a number of Jewish, my interest in Judaica and Jewish things continued with the film, and I met the family. I met Tanya, whom you saw in the film, the real star of the film. She was so wonderful, so devoted to her husband. And the family just took me in as an honorary goyish, I guess.
That's wonderful. Yes, the film is magnificent, and I am fascinated by your involvement and your interest in it. From what I understand, Chaim Plutzik loved Yiddish. He spoke Yiddish as a child. Am I correct?
Right.
That was his first language. And so, you know, you told me that your family was from Ireland. And one of the things that this entire festival is dedicated to is this idea that Yiddish is everywhere. It's a language without a country. Just about every other language in the world, except maybe Esperanto, has a country. It has a place. Yiddish never had a place. But I know that Yiddish and Jewish life in Ireland was quite substantial. Do you know a little bit that you could share with us?
In Ireland?
Yes.
Well, yes, the former Lord Mayor of Dublin was Irish, was Jewish, Robert Briscoe. And that was
Only in
something that I
America.
wondered about. Only in America, as you say.
Right. Um, tell me a little bit more about Chaim Plutzik's involvement in the Yiddish language and his life in Yiddish.
Yeah. Well, as you saw in the film, he was born in Brooklyn, which is a great place to learn Yiddish if you were, or to speak Yiddish if you were born there about 1911. His parents had recently come from Belarus, and they brought their culture, their language with them. And then he went to, he didn't really speak English until he was 8 years old when he started going to a one-room schoolhouse up in Connecticut. The family moved to Connecticut for fresh air, and they owned a farm there. And Chaim's father was the leader of the Jewish community in that town near Waterbury. And he instilled in his son and his other children the love for the language and love for Jewish culture. And then Chaim went to Trinity College, where he learned Christianity in Hartford, Connecticut, where he learned about the Christian culture. And I think Chaim knows more about Christianity than I do. He was really very, very great scholar of language and of culture. But he maintained an interest in Yiddish throughout his life. We just recently found many letters that Tanya has collected in Yiddish from family members in Russia and other people that we're going to have translated eventually.
Oh, how wonderful. Wow. Well, please let me know if we can help you with that, because we are very involved in translations from Yiddish into English. So I'm curious if Yiddish was his first language, as it was mine. I didn't actually learn English until I went to public school in the Bronx. So I was in the Bronx, but much, much later than Chaim Plutzik. But he wrote in English, and English was the language that he created in. Do you have any insight as to why he didn't write in Yiddish?
Well, Chaim, I think it's it's probably something to do with history. You know, when Chaim Plutzik came to the U.S. in 1911, the Jews and other immigrants were supposed to assimilate. They were supposed to be American. They were supposed to throw off their old ways and learn English and become American citizens, which he did, of course. But I think during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, when he was going to school and going to graduate school, this was his compelling thing, to learn English. So I think he didn't reject Yiddish. He didn't reject Jewish culture, but I think in his interest to become American, he focused more on his English studies.
Right. That's you know, it's fascinating because to me, in many ways, that was the Jewish crime of the 20th century, that through a combination of assimilation, don't speak Yiddish, learn English, become an American, assimilate, through the combination of the Holocaust, which decimated the Yiddish language and half of the European Yiddish-speaking community. And then on top of that, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, when the entire Jewish focus went to Hebrew as the Jewish language,
Yes.
And Yiddish became associated with the Holocaust and the victimhood. And so 1,000 years of literature and culture and poetry and music and theater just suddenly was swept under the rug,
Yes.
shall we say.
And it was thought to be the language of your grandmother or it was not hip to speak Yiddish in those days.
Which is why it's so ironic that today in 2020, Yiddish has become sexy. It's not just hip, it's suddenly become sexy all over the world, on television, movies, film, so many outlets, and even our little, International Yiddish Fest is attracting, tens of thousands of people from all over the world. And we even had 2 programs, one of which was called Yiddish is Sexy. It's fascinating. Edward, I know that you have dedicated so much of your time and your work to Chaim Plotzik and his poetry and his life. Is there anything that you would like to share with our audience that perhaps wasn't in the film? Because very often these films, so much ends up on the cutting floor. I wonder, what is it that didn't make it into the film that you'd like to share?
Well, we tried to give a capsule picture of everything that he did during his life. I think we neglected the World War II era. You know, he was stationed in England during World War II and wrote a lot of his poetry and got a lot of his interest in European culture when he was there. And I think he wrote letters back to his wife and back to family members, some of them in Yiddish, that we really neglected to talk about his war experiences directly. So I think that was one thing that we should have done more in the film.
And that's very important in terms of our festival as well, because one of the major elements of our festival was based on a grant we received from Miami-Dade County to create liberation commemoration events celebrating the end of World War II, the liberation of the concentration camps, and the survivors. So that actually fits in really well for us in the idea that Chaim Plotzik was very much active in the war effort. So that's wonderful.
Yes, his book, A Letter from a Young Poet, which was a 72-page letter that he wrote to Odell Shepard, who was his mentor at Trinity. In that, he talks about he ended the letter right at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and he talked about his obligation to fight Nazism. It was the great peril of his time. So I think even though he was basically very pacifistic and he didn't like to hurt people, he realized it was very important to enlist in the cause, and that's how he ended up in England during the war. And interestingly, I went to Norwich, England, a couple of years ago to find where he lived and where he stayed there. And the day I was in London, it turns out the entire community from Norwich came down to London. It was November 11th, Remembrance Day, and we were invited to St. Paul's Cathedral for evensong. So you have all these American and Jewish people sitting in the choir stalls at St. Paul's Cathedral, honoring the people of World War I and II.
So that actually brings up a very interesting question. And you mentioned that he went to Trinity and suddenly was in a Christian cultural environment. And obviously in the film, they talked about how there were very few Jews that were allowed to work in certain areas and in academic positions, etc. Can you talk for a moment about how do you think Chaim Plotzik reconciled his very Jewish nature and his background with the fact that he was suddenly placed in these very Christian environments? Did that create any kind of conflict for him?
Well, we Christians call ourselves spiritual Semites. That is the word that after the Vatican Council in the 60s, when they tried to reconcile with the Jews, and because, when I grew up in a Christian environment, we still talked about the perfidious Jews in our prayers that killed Christ and all that was very horrible stuff. But that was thankfully changed in the Vatican II era in the 60s, and we were told we are spiritual Semites. So we have this connection, the same scriptures, except for many of the same scriptures. And I think Chaim understood that. And I'm thinking specifically of his poem For TSE Only. T.S. Eliot was a notorious anti-Semite and wrote that's mentioned in the film. He wrote about Baedeker with the cigar and all of that, the anti-Semitic poems of Eliot. But Plotzik wrote a poem of reconciliation for TSE Only. He said, "Come, Thomas, let us weep together for our exile." And he used Christian imagery. I wrote a paper on that for the T.S. Eliot Society that was published, that Plotzik used the language of Christian compassion in this poem to try to reconcile with T.S. Eliot. And I think that was in Chaim Plutzik's nature. He was a very compassionate and loving person, and he got this from his Jewish heritage, but he was also able to see the reflections of that in the Christianity that he studied at Trinity and at Yale. One of his great mentors, in addition to Odell Shepard, was Mark Van Doren, who was very supportive of Jewish students. You know, there were Jewish students were not welcome in many campuses in those days, and Mark Van Doren, who taught at Columbia, went out of his way to welcome Jewish students and to encourage them, and he was especially a great mentor of Chaim Plutzik. We have letters that they exchanged as well.
Wow. That's fascinating. Really, really, truly.
And interestingly, Mark Van Doren's son married a Jewish woman from Lithuania who did a film on the Holocaust and Yiddish in Lithuania. So there's interesting connections there.
We have a word in
Yiddish.
We have a word for people like Chaim Plutzik in Yiddish, a mensch.
Ah, yes, I understand.
He was a real mensch.
He was.
And you know, part of what I always felt about growing up within the Yiddish cultural world was that Yiddishkeit, you know, the essence of Jewishness, was actually Menschlichkeit, which was the essence of being a decent and good person. And it sounds to me like Chaim Plutzik was very much a mensch.
I've never heard anyone say a bad word about him. In all of my research and my studies, he was universally loved.
That's wonderful. Is there anything else you would like to share with us about the work? Tell us a little bit more about the Spanish translations and why Spanish and not Russian or French.
Well, they've already been translated into Russian. And in fact, Joseph Brodsky, the Nobel laureate, translated part of Horatio in the 1970s into Russian and presented it on the stage in Moscow.
Wow.
And we've had poems translated into Hebrew, into Croatian. I found that there was a Chinese, one of the first poems of Chaim that was translated into a foreign language was translated into Chinese in 1966. It was published in Taiwan. How it got there, I'm still trying to find out. So it's part of the universal appeal of poetry. But we realize that today, especially in Miami, which is a center of Cuban and Spanish culture, there's a great deal of interest in we wanted to expand the audience for Chaim Plutzik's poem to include people who might not have known him through his English poems. So we asked George B. Henson, who's at Monterey International University in California, who's one of the leading Spanish translators in the country. He agreed to help translate and edit this project for us. It's going to be published this fall, so we're looking forward to that. And then when Richard Blanco gave his foreword, it was just a great stamp of approval. We're just so grateful for all the people that are contributing to this.
Oh, that sounds so wonderful. The last program we did at 2:00 was called The New Path of Yiddish Song in Latin America. And it was all about this combination of Yiddish in Latin and, you know, Central and South America, and how the Yiddish world was enormous in the South American and Central American communities. And so I think it's wonderful that this Jewish poet, an American poet, like Chaim Plutzik, will be translated into Spanish. Thank you for doing that. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
All right. Well,
thank you so much for having me today.
Well, thank you. We're very honored to have you as part of our International Yiddish Fest. And so thank you so much for coming. I hope we'll see you again soon. Please send me that information about the Library of Congress.
I certainly will.
And we will, I'm sure, meet again in the future. So
yes, thank you so much.
All right, bye-bye. I am so honored to be here at the Betsy Hotel, having been able to present to you as part of our festival this incredible film about the poet Chaim Plutzik. And those of you who don't know Chaim Plutzik, you should look him up. chaimplotzickpoetry.com, I'm pretty sure, and see how this Yiddish-speaking young man was able to become an important force in American poetry. And so our festival is about presenting the best of what we can find in all the different mediums, whether it's poetry or music or theater or film, lectures. We have been doing as many different kinds of programming, contemporary programming, as well as period programming.